Observance of self. The concept taught in this work is that higher centers are always speaking to us, advising what to do. However, we cannot hear or quite simply ignore them. We can be sure that since the objective of this work is to connect us with higher centers and their messages, then one of the first things we are taught is to observe ourselves, which must have connection with ultimately getting in contact with those higher centers. They are of course fully formed and functional, however we cannot hear them. There has to be some reason for self-observation, hence it is right to say that if we try to observe ourselves quite simply because we have been told to do so, then we will not be observing anything in the right way. We will not understand why we should be doing so, and what deeper meaning lies in this practice. We might be inclined to believe, why on earth should I observe myself? For what purpose and what reason? If we have not assembled a wide enough grasp of ideas in this work, and what the ultimate goal is, if all of the ascending scales illustrated in the great ray of creation and its side octave, all these teachings about higher level and lower level, fewer laws and more laws, along with all that is said about personality and essence, would mean nothing to us conceptually. They'd simply lie scattered about in memory, having no coordinated and emotional life in them at all. In which case, self-observation would quite simply wind up being some dreary task imposed upon us, this teaching its dogma and practice, some ritual. Perhaps, however, we have to get a much more subtle and internal idea of work. So let's consider self-observation in the light of why we are told to practice so. It is brought to our attention because it can lead to becoming more aware of the influences of higher centers. We cannot hear these influences because there is a kind of impediment lying between them and ourselves. So what then is the veil made up of? It is those parts within that are unconscious to us, which we do not realize, which we are unaware of as existing in ourselves. It is pointed out that an act of self-observation admits a ray of light into our inner darkness. That darkness is what could be called the veil, which does not transmit any influences of higher centers. Everyone must come to terms eventually with their dark side, the secrets and pain of their silent room. But this is only possible after long and sincere self-observation, carried out with definite reason and not simply as a mechanical task. Remember that all self-observation must be a conscious effort. We could agree that everyone has eyes in them that they are unaware of or choose to ignore. We live in a false personality, playing to a narrative that we maintain and not in the real world. We are full of pictures of ourselves, and owing to the action of buffers which prevent our seeing contradictions, we feel quite at peace with everything. However, the objective of any work on self is to agitate struggle within, to be at war with any sense of fake contentment and complacency. A struggle between positive and negative which causes friction, heat within us, that is then able to excite the crucible within and light the flame of our inner altar, Agni, whose purpose we are encouraged to sustain if we wish to observe any change taking place. So, what is the method used in order to accomplish this objective? The method of self-observation, whereby we gradually become more conscious of what lies within us and begin to discard those beloved pictures of ourselves, the forms of imagination that we maintain. Recall how the driver is in the public house, drinking, which means that they are living in imagination, in pictures, in the pantomime of themselves, casting imaginary I as the hero of their narrative. The first thing to be done, therefore, is to awaken the driver. We each have a dark side to ourselves that we know nothing about or elect to ignore, a side that is not conscious to us but yet acts. Into this darkness, a ray of light must enter through self-observation, carried out in accordance with what the work teaches us to observe, to look out for, and become aware of. This dark side of the self must gradually be connected with an idea of itself, and a pattern has to be developed, a commingling of these two sides where a balance can be struck. Otherwise, we fail to ascend the tree of life, that caduceus to higher self. Unless a ray of light enters the darkness, this cannot be accomplished, and in consequence, we never feel the influences of higher centers, except as vague whispers from inner voice that we generally tend to ignore, because those influences are damped down and obliterated by the dark side, which is that external side of ourselves. As a rule, we see it only in other people and do not attribute any such thing to ourselves. We tend always to blame others and accuse them of evil thoughts, of ill intent, suspicious behavior, bad talking, unkindness, lying or indifference, infidelity, unreliability, of meanness, insincerity, and so on. This other side of ourselves, of which we are not conscious, we tend to observe in others, to project onto Plato's wall, so to speak. And as a result, that forms one of the great causes of human unhappiness, a constant turmoil into which almost everyone is drawn when regarding one another. In order to alter this state of affairs, the work begins with self-observation, with letting a ray of light or glimpse of conscious awareness into that inner darkness. Here, the teaching of work is emphatic and so should not be misunderstood. When we study the tendency to blame others and register it, deliberately beginning to try to observe the same things in ourselves, then we are undertaking one of the first and most important steps of personal work, in work on ourselves. And unless we do this, we cannot get anywhere. If we attempt to progress without doing this over an extended period, we are like people trying to see through a window that is covered with grime and stains. The darkness has curious properties because in some indescribable way it is ourselves. It's a kind of living darkness, like cataracts, which can only be cleared away by increasing the light of consciousness through self-observation. We have to polish the mirror through effort and through friction, by doing and not just talking. An increasing light of conscious awareness is the result of long, quiet, and sincere self-observation, a long, private noticing of oneself, our actions, of how we speak, what we think, and how we are thinking, our emotions, and how we are feeling in any given moment. This level of awareness comes through practice, a conscious practice on self. It is clear then that the initial task of this work is to become more conscious of that dark side of ourselves, and this means we gradually lose all of our ordinary ideas of self, which we feel at first as a loss of personality, as losing ground and a kind of weakening of ourselves, as a kind of death, because we, such as we are, have to die to ourselves. If one does not allow oneself to become negative, and this is strongly emphasized, then recognizes the folly of negative states continually arising, we begin to realize that in this new and strange feeling of oneself, there is far more real strength and understanding than anything in the pseudo-I that previously ruled. We can indeed find that quite new thoughts, feelings, insights, and meaning begin to arise for us. The reason being that traces of higher influences can finally begin to be heard and then considered. So much so that where formerly we only saw one thing, one way, and one meaning, a singular choice between what we thought was right or wrong, we now see a dozen or more meanings and choices. Where we thought there was only one step between Do and Re, or Re and me, in some previous barren, rigid and stilted understanding, we now see whole inner octaves extending between these notes. All increase of understanding lies in seeing finer and finer differences, subtler and more beautiful meanings, all interwoven and full of a magical quality all of their own. which we realize are quite different from our previous heavy, gross sense of thinking and feeling whereby we formerly lived. This is our first rebirth, the first revelation born again of self. These finer visitations of understanding cannot enter into our conscious awareness, become a continual internal source of meaning that never dies and is inexhaustible, unless we make that dark side of ourselves increasingly conscious. And this awakening of the dark side, or side in darkness, inevitably leads to a complete change in our idea and estimation of ourselves. We may feel in this that we are losing sight of ourselves. Where we used to be so sure and convinced, so ready to do and to act, speak or criticize, we now feel a sense of uncertainty, because we see so much more in every situation than we previously noticed. It is not a negative uncertainty, but a positive uncertainty. It is not a feeling of helplessness, but a feeling of strength. Because we see clearly that where we were so sure before, we then were very weak. The certainty we felt was the certainty of recklessness, the certainty of ignorance, which can only steal our life force, and which continually leads to the wrong outcomes and utterly useless friction. The turn of unfortunate events that we were quite sure could be ascribed to others and nothing at all to do with our own misguided reactions. How certain we used to be, but now we see how mechanical we once were. How we used to think that we understood everything and could do things, yet now realize that we had no understanding whatsoever, and in fact, everything simply happened to us mechanically, according to the nature of our machine. How we'd allowed our operating system to be written by whatever software we'd uploaded. How much we used to attribute to ourselves and pride ourselves in, and how much of that now was evidently done by that machine that we took for granted as ourselves. In seeing this other side to the self, our dark side, into which the work says that we must penetrate, we render it more conscious to ourselves through self-observation, and must remember that the doctrine of eyes are foundational to this process. We have to see the dark side, but not to identify with it. We have to make it more conscious by not taking it as ourselves, to acknowledge its presence but not to become it. We cannot suppress the darkness, but need to see it for what it is, Mani the wolf, who lies within us all. This is a struggle of great difficulty, and we have to remind ourselves to be cognizant of that point, which is important. Remember that everything we are taught in work itself fits together, and we cannot do any work, say, with one idea of it, omitting others in execution. We cannot take self-observation apart from the doctrine of eyes without doing ourselves great harm. The reason for this is that if to everything we observe in ourselves we say I or me, and so identify with it, the result will be complete confusion. We will become what we observe, and this is fatal. We have to take our eyes objectively to see different things in us as we see different objects in a room. We do not take the table, chair, the book or lamp as ourselves. One must never say that what I observe is I, but we need to acknowledge and note that this I that we observe lies within us. This belongs to not identifying. Self-observation carried out with the idea of not identifying with what we observe is the keynote of this system's practice, and it is a very difficult thing to carry out. It may be some time before we see what each method taught really means. We remember that we must divide ourselves into two, as an observing side and an observed side, so, in other words, should not identify with what we observe. This is the same as saying that we cannot change if we identify with everything that goes on within us, with every mood, every thought, every sensation, and every form of fantasy or imagination. Again, it means that we have to take ourselves objectively, to take our psychology and all that lies within it objectively, as we gradually observe and gradually become more conscious. What does it mean to take a thing objectively? I do not take the table I am looking at objectively, as part of myself. I take it as an object that is not me and that I am distinct from. This is taking a thing subjectively. However, work teaches that we have to take the things in our inner life objectively. I notice, for example, an evil, malicious thought in my mind. It is quite useless to burst into tears and say, "How evil and malicious I am," as that would be taking the I that thinks like this subjectively as myself. It would be identifying with it, saying I or me to it, and this would be quite useless, leading nowhere. On the contrary, I must see the thought, then try to see what I or group of I's it comes from, then watch what they are up to, what they wish to do or to make me say. Then I will be observing these I's objectively. I will be observing it and not me. Of course, if I consent to them, I shall become them, and they will rush out of me to do all the harm that they can do. If I try to hold them back by force, taking them as myself, I shall soon lose the battle, because then part of my life force will be going into them, part of my feeling of self. This will always happen if I cannot feel that they are not me, and that they come round at intervals to try to persuade me that they are me, begging me to say I to them. It's nothing personal, they are simply doing their best to survive. So that if you touch them, they will immediately take force from you, part of your feeling of I will run into them. If you shine the light of conscious awareness upon them, they will awaken and emerge from the shadows. You then have, as it were, no magic circle that you can draw around yourself to stand within internally. That is why it is so dangerous to go to sleep for too long, and not to work at all, or think about work and what you are doing with it. Sometimes people allow themselves to be for a comparatively long time unaware of this work. They step out, as it were, of any magic circle they might have begun to draw around themselves, and then all sorts of eyes fasten onto them like so many leeches, sucking the life force out to sustain themselves. Then, before we know where we are, some ruffian gets a hold of us, having, as it were, drawn some blood from them, and so claiming a blood relationship. Then we feel ourselves backsliding. That is why it is so important to have aim in connection with some eyes that you know only lead to trouble and useless suffering. About certain things where you must keep inner silence, as the work advises. What does it mean to keep inner silence? Unpleasant eyes may be chattering incessantly inside of you, stoking dissent and provoking argument within. If you engage in discourse with them, you no longer maintain inner silence. You can speak to negative eyes if you are very careful about how you do it, that is, if you see them quite objectively within you and are not astonished that such exist in you. As we get to know this dark side through an increased light of consciousness, then none of us will be astonished at the eyes they find there, whose existence will be accepted, but with which we must not identify. Only experience and hard-learned lessons can provide that insight. The meaning of self-observation is to make our dark self increasingly conscious and to commingle it gradually with our previous imaginary ideas of self. This brings about a complete change of the feeling of oneself and begins to dissolve imaginary I. At the same time, while the process of this annihilation of attributes is taking place, we begin to feel influences reach us from another source of meaning. Those influences that could not reach us previously because there was a veil of darkness intervening. We can think of that dark side as the other person in us that we tend to observe so easily in people. When you begin to make this other person, that dark self, more conscious to you, it is no longer projected onto others, and your entire relationship to everyone else begins to change. You, in fact, see different individuals for the first time, and so release them. We must, however, realize that this applies to each of us. Do not start with the idea that your neighbor should change and release you. You must release them.